The foreign policy of Democrats and Republicans, what is the difference between the two when it comes to foreign policy?
There is no difference. I mean, let's just talk about it from all right, so Noam Chomsky, who, by the way, is controlled opposition if I ever saw one.
Okay.
Again, the best way to check is to look at foreign policy. The reason why you need to look at foreign policy is because that is the official modus operandi, the MO of empire, all right? So you have an imperialist country, that a white country that has made a pact and allegiance with all other white countries that we're all going to respect each other, but then we're going to fucking subjugate everybody else, because the age of discovery and colonization was happening during the 1600s as well. That was like the early stages, and it really ramped up after that, right? If you look at their foreign policy, they actually call it the Washington Consensus. Bipartisan, right? Both parties agree that we're going to go around bombing the shit out of people of color countries, right? Taking them over, overthrowing their governments, installing dictators that will allow... Here's a crazy stat. Okay, you ready for this? In 1996, 13% of all Korean companies were owned by foreign investors. Okay, 13%. After the Asian financial crisis and the IMF came in, the IMF is the loan shark arm of American empire. In 2000, 30% of Korean companies was owned by foreign investors. Samsung is over 50% owned by non-Koreans.
Right now?
Yes. Yes! That is empire. That is empire. They killed 30,000 people, including babies, on Jeju Island to set up this fake country called South Korea, and massacred 1/5 of the population of that country in order to maintain control of that colony. And to this day, it is a vassal state. That is the most racist situation I could ever think of in my entire life. They did the same thing to the Philippines in 1898. And the whole reason was that...
Well, you're saying South Korea is not a real country.
No, I mean, obviously it's a fake country, but regardless, we're at where we're at now, right? So you kind of have to look at things from the here and now perspective, and where do we go from here, right? What is to be done? But if you're looking at it just from a historical perspective, they held fake elections. Those weren't, they only allowed, from their perspective, okay, I'm going to say right wing, even though I just spent the whole time arguing that a right wing doesn't exist anymore, at least from a European point of view. But they put all the right wing police and the chaebols, right? The Chinilpa, the Imperial Japanese collaborators that got rich and fat, the Koreans that were traitors and worked with Imperial Japan to subjugate their own country. Those people were the only ones who were allowed to vote in the election. While they massacred other Koreans. This was before the war.
Is this common knowledge, or?
No. Korea suppressed all mention of this until I believe it was 2012. 2012.
I see. And this was all done with the United States' support, or were they the ones actually directing this?
They were under direction by the U.S. Central Command and the U.S. military government in Korea. So the way white supremacist empire works, and this is ever since I want to say the 1800s, Evelyn Baring, the Duke Cromer, or whoever, he was this British politician. He argued in front of the British government, that the best way to maintain British Empire was to hire locals and natives from that country, turn the natives and put them in charge and have them report to us, as opposed to direct control.
I guess it's very like the line you read earlier from 1969, the traitorous gangsters of our own community.
I know. When I was first active, within certain Asian American spaces and talking like that, it was crazy to me to see the vitriol I got. I mean, you got backlash and reaction from all these self-identifying conservative Asians who are really fucking stupid because no such thing exists. You guys are just patsies, right? But those guys at least are so broken mentally that they just don't care, right? But the liberals on the Democratic side, like yeah, they actually feel like they're doing something, you know, like they know they've sold their souls. And this is true because I've met a lot of these Asian Americans that are in so-called high positions. I mean, we're all marginal at the end of the day, but you know, I've met a few of them, you know, and when I talk to them,
these are the Asian Americans that are like well-known. They're well-known authors, or
yeah, they're well known. I won't like put names out there or whatever. You know, they know who I'm talking about. But like, they know that they've sold themselves out, right? But there's this feeling that this is the best option. This is the only option because their thinking has been America is so strong with propaganda, right? The brainwashing that I work when we're talking about, right? That they can't imagine. It's either, oh, I have to be a Trump supporter or I have to be a liberal. And, you know, I really saw an interesting comic online, floating around online years ago, where there's an Asian girl in bed with a Democrat and an Asian girl in bed with a Republican white guy. And both of them are saying, I hate Asian men. And like a little Asian kid is asking the question, what's the difference? Right? Like, because in the Democratic relationship, the Asian girl is telling the white guy, I hate Asian men. And then in the Republican relationship, the white guy is telling the Asian girl, I hate Asian men. And then the little Asian boy that's like apparently their son or whatever is like, what's going on? I can't tell the difference. They're the same.
Elliot Roger.
Right? Yeah. And it's true. They really are the same people, you know? Because the foundation, liberalism as a whole, right? Like this idea of, you know, like lack of government control. Like, so from a communist perspective, shit, I gave myself away there. From a communist perspective.
What do you mean you gave it away?
I said we, I should have said they. Because to be honest with you, you know, like I struggle with being a communist too, you know, like.
So you are a communist.
I don't know. I would say communists are right, but it's really hard for me personally, because you know of the nature of my class, right? I'm a member of the petty bourgeoisie, right? So like I have, you know, some crumbs from the table, right? So it's hard for me to just be like full on, you know, rah rah rah.
Okay, but you have no problem with communists.
No, I actually feel like they're a major force for good in this world, despite their problem, you know, whatever problematic things you can bring up. Overall, I think holistically, they've been the ones driving. There's a reason why all the national independence movements of third world countries, including within Asia, were backed by communists or were communists themselves. And this is true not just in Asia, like in Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, everywhere. Anywhere where people are fighting Western hegemony for real, they're communist. But you know what's funny? Like all these democratic Asian women, for example, like they would blast me and call me a tanky, you know, like pejoratively, and say, oh, you know, like you're so crazy, like with this blah, 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 you know, like they couldn't fathom the ideology that I had because their minds have been so like lobotomized to only see this particular type of political sphere of liberalism. That's it.
A tanky, if I remember correctly, a tanky is a derogatory term for a communist who is a what do you call a
supporters of the Soviet Union? Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah, at a very broad level. I mean, it's become meaningless. It's just become a pejorative for like.
But if someone like that calls you a tanky, I think because I guess what Stalin or somebody sent tanks to run over people, something like that.
I mean,
is that where that comes from? I think I remember hearing.
Well, here's the thing. All right, so here's the thing about genuine communists. Okay, genuine communists believe in government. They believe that a government should be reflective of the will of the people, right? So, and therefore, if it's a reflection of the people, then the government should be the undisputed authority, so long as it has, you know, it truly represents the citizenry. Does that make sense?
Sure, of course, right.
Right. So communists are not afraid to like, in fact, that's their thing, right? Like revolutionary socialism. Their thing is to seize actual power, political power, because that's the only way you're going to make change. And you don't get political power by participating in elections.
Like
It
Andrew
doesn't
Yang.
happen, right? It doesn't happen in a liberal society. It just doesn't.
Okay. So she called you a tanky, but what do you call someone who calls you a tanky? What do you call what's a bad name for a liberal then, or someone who?
I mean, I've been calling them Uncle Chans and Lou's since like 5 years ago, like basically like Uncle Toms, right? Like all these people like don't really understand like the nature of the world or the society around them. All they know is about how to hide and try to survive, right? So going all the way back to your original question, because I know we went on a digression here, like this is like bootleg history channel. But like going back to like coronavirus and COVID-19, you have all these Asians in America right now that are so ignorant, so stunningly ignorant, right? And by the way, I include Andrew Yang in this. Andrew Yang actually came out and said, oh, I can foresee in a coming generation when Asian people will be shot just for being Asian. And I'm just like, Andrew, this happened already, right? It happened in the 90s. It happened in California. A white supremacist named Patrick Purdy at the Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California, went on a shooting spree, right? Killed 5 Filipino school children and wounded 32 others, led to the assault rifle ban in California, okay? He was a white supremacist that hated Asians. It was literally in his manifesto. Of course, back then, they just called him a mentally ill lone wolf, and people actually took that. It was a different time.
Right.
But like, I couldn't believe Andrew Yang was out here. He lived through that. But he wasn't aware. Like, this made national news.
Right.
So what the fuck were you doing when this was happening, Andrew? What the fuck were you doing when like Asian school kids were getting shot down, mowed down in 1989 by a white supremacist? Literally a white, he belonged to like Aryan nations or some shit. And now you're going out and saying, and positing it as some far off thing, like, oh, yeah, it hasn't happened, but it will happen. I'm warning you, I'm like this, I'm predicting the future. No, motherfucker, you don't even know the past. You don't even know what you lived through.
Did you see his latest piece? I think
I did.
Yeah, I think it was Washington Post or New York Times. He said something about how now is the time for us to be more American.
Yeah,
some model along those lines. What did you think of that?
I mean, there's always been, all right, so this is not unique to Asians, but I'll use Asians as an example. Like the Japanese, what is it, the JLA? Japanese League of Americans. I can't remember. Sorry, for some reason I'm drawing a blank. Anyways, during World War II, like they would crack down. Japanese Americans would actually crack down on other Japanese Americans that avoided the draft.
Wow.
Yeah, while they were being rounded up and put in concentration camps.
So while the Japanese Americans were being rounded up and being put into camps, there were a group of Japanese Americans who were
civil rights group, an Asian American civil rights group,
a Japanese American civil rights group that was hunting down, looking for Japanese Americans who were avoiding the draft to fight in World War II.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you can call it what it is, right? Like, the Japanese American Citizens League. Sorry, the JACL.
What's the rationale behind that?
Well, the idea is like if I lick the boot, I hope I don't get crushed, right? If I lick the boot, I hope I don't get stomped.
They're proving their loyalty, or
right, just like the Chinese Americans that were snitching on the other Chinese Americans that were actually like trying to fight for a better life for Asians.
I guess like the ones who would call you a tanky, people like
that. Yeah, would call me a tanky, or call me a misogynist, right? Like all this shit, right? Like they apparently I'm like racist and anti-black. And it's basically all the shit that they use, the same shit that the Democratic Party used against Bernie Sanders. Like again, they don't care. They do not care about any of these issues. They do not care about equality and justice. They're liberal, okay? They believe in making money and letting big business run the country. Are
you saying that these Asian American progressives that call themselves progressives, they actually don't care about black people, they don't care about healthcare or any of this stuff, that they're just in the game for money?
Yeah, I mean, to some certain degree, right? Like, a lot of like the more vocal people you find on social media, which is such garbage, right? They're actually being funded, like, you know, I'm just gonna say it, like, you know, they're being funded by the Ford Foundation. There's not even a secret. 18 Million Rising, which consists of a whole bunch of these like Asian American so-called activists on social media, blogs and Twitter, Spear and all this, right? Including Angry Asian Man and all of them. They're actually paid by what was the CIA front to crack down on third world countries during the Cold War. I can't believe these people actually co-opt the Asian American movement, right? Of course, like erasing all like the actual communist elements of it, right? The thing that actually drove it. And then pretending like they are the heirs or the inheritors of this proud tradition by telling you to stop wondering why all these Asian girls are in love with white guys. You know what I mean? Like, this is so fucking...
Wait, can you tell me, what is the Ford Foundation?
So the Ford Foundation was set up alongside the Rand Institute as part of, like, basically counterintelligence operations against both POC and equality movements here, like feminist movements and the things here. They were sent to infiltrate and crack down on it, all right? And then also, like, to fund things overseas, right? It was started by Henry Ford.
Henry Ford started the Ford Foundation. Who wrote a book called The International Jew, didn't he? And he was a supporter of Hitler, wasn't he?
That's right.
Okay, so he started the Ford Foundation, which is to target people of color organizations or
rob them of their revolutionary substance, liberalize them, take out all the communist elements that demand revolution. Because here's the thing. Communism demands revolution. Communism says you can't just sit on your ass hoping things get better, because they never get better that way. You have to actually get out of your chair and take violent means, if necessary, in order to seize the government. That's communist ideology, straight up. It's revolutionary in nature. Once you remove that, you have no idea. There's nothing to do, right? Once you remove that, what are you going to do when you tell someone that they're oppressed and they're marginalized, but there's no way to change anything, right? And especially under a liberal society where, you know, all the sheep are trained to think of themselves as individuals, right, that have no like collective power. The only solution that people can come up with is consumerism. Consumerism meaning, oh, I'm going to buy more tickets to the Mulan movie. Oh, I'm going to patronize more Asian restaurants. You know, they think this is liberatory or anti-racist work. Oh, I support Aquafina, you know, so I'm anti-race.
I see. So when people are getting really excited about movies like Crazy Rich Asians,
right,
that's part of this fake progress.
Yeah, and you know, it comes from both sides, right? You know, both sides of I say both sides because they're all the same side. But okay, so you have the left-hand side of liberalism, right? Like a lot of the Democratic side. And you'll have people saying, oh, you need to support the actors and the actresses, even though they're all uncles and like minstrels and taking shitty roles and all that kind of stuff. You have to support them, right? Because more women CEOs, more minority concentration camp guards. Like that is the whole liberal ideology. We just need more of our kind as the oppressor, and it's okay, right? On the right-hand side, then you have people saying, like the Republican, like, you know, a lot of Asian guys, they're like, oh, yeah, it's good for us because it makes us look sexy. It's going to improve our chances. It's going to help emasculation. Well, hey, motherfucker, COVID-19 hit, and now you can't get a date to save your fucking life. It's even worse than before. You are sitting here telling me if I don't support this movie, you know, nothing is going to change and it's going to be for the better. But if we keep supporting this movie, that and K-pop and like whatever other like fantasist, like utopian idealism is going to come through and rescue your ass. Never happens that way. It only gets worse. You either build power structures. You either fight to take power. And when I say fight, I mean literally, again, from a communist perspective, you have to actually physically fight them. Listen to the way they talked, right? We have to wage an armed war. That's what the Iworquen said in 1969. Ivy League students said this. Columbia University students said this.
I mean, it does seem that whatever gains, quote unquote gains, regardless of how superficial it may seem, whatever gains made by Asian America or Asians has been by emulating the West, for example, music with K-pop, you know, coming out with better pop music, doing better dances, better, whatever basically the West does, just do it a little better or louder or something, and that seems to be the formula to be somewhat accepted or, you know, make it or get some kind of recognition from the West. What do you think about that?
I think the only thing K-pop did for me is that Asian girls were more likely to date me because I might look like some K-pop idol or something.
Did you notice though there's a lot of especially online, a lot of white women even who are like very, like they're all looking for some Korean oppa or something. Did you notice?
Sure.
Like
but this is not happening on any sort of wide scale. You have to understand that Asians are like 5% of the population in America. And clearly you can see from all the racist attacks that are happening against Asians, nobody is yelling oppa and sucking my dick. Instead, they're waiting outside my house with a vat of acid ready to throw it in my face. You know what I mean? You know, like, I think it's just like really difficult for Asians to grasp this because they have never been brought up to think like that, right? So you know it's not an Asian thing, and you know it's not a Confucian culture thing. It's not any of this bullshit that they constantly bitch about online. Like, they have such a lively debate about it, but it's all irrelevant, useless bullshit, you know?
Okay, so what do you think, I mean, right now during COVID-19 and you know, during all this racist stuff going on, what should the Asian American community do?
You know, there's a reason I brought up like my personal like dating life or romantic situation at the beginning of this, you know, and thank you for asking that question, because I actually want to talk a little bit about emasculation, right? Asian male emasculation. And I know a lot of people talk about it, but I actually want to talk about the first time we were ever truly emasculated in America, right? Asians in America. And that was in 1875 with the passage of the Page Act. Okay? So when they passed that law in 1875, they said the reason we're banning Chinese women from immigrating to this country is because they carry a whole bunch of diseases which don't affect them. But if they are around white people, they will pollute our society and we'll all die.
Chinese women?
Yeah, because they're all like whores and prostitutes. That was the rationale. That was the official legal rationale for why they passed this act.
So they let Chinese men in, I guess, to work?
No, because the Chinese men were already here, right?
Okay.
So when social scientists actually studied this, historians actually studied this, there was a paper that came out, a research paper, that talked about how this was actually the first time Asian men were emasculated. There was like 100,000 Chinese Americans by 1890 in this country. Again, remember what I said, Asians are only here because of white supremacy. So the Chinese Americans that fled here were fleeing here because of the Opium Wars, because the UK had forced China to take opium and then started a war over it, right? So that's the reason why Chinese people were even coming here.
The British got the Chinese hooked on drugs, and then when the Chinese said they didn't want it anymore, the British went to war to force them to stay hooked on the drugs, something like that, isn't it?
Yeah, and then so there was a bunch of economic refugees from that war, and America invited them over, right? Sometimes just kidnapped them. That's where the term Shanghai comes from, to get shanghaied or kidnapped. It meant like sometimes you had these coolies that were kidnapped and shipped overseas, literally no different than African slaves. We were enslaved too by Europe at one point. Anyways, so they came over here, and at first they were treated like model minorities, right? I mean, think about how crazy that is, right? People were actually saying Asians are very able to like get along with white people, you know, like Really, politicians were saying this. And then in the span of a few short years, because of the rise of the Know Nothing movement, which is very similar to Donald Trump's whole like make America white again type of, you know, movement. So like it's liberalism, but with white supremacy on top of it, right? White supremacist capitalism. So they were saying, okay, well, you know, one way to get rid of all these undesirables, Asian Americans, is to make sure that they don't produce any more Asians, first of all, right? So they passed a ban on the women. And literally the rationale was, we'll ban the women, that way they can't make Asian babies. We want to make sure Asian guys just don't get laid, because if they get laid, they're going to have kids. And if they have kids, then there's going to be more of these guys running around, right? So they banned the women first. By the way, America never talks about that. That's still suppressed. They only talk about Chinese exclusion, which came 7 years later. They don't talk about the Page Act and how its whole purpose was to eliminate, ethnically cleanse Asians in America, the 100,000 plus Chinese American men that came here and built the country, you know? And after they banned the women and then they passed Chinese exclusion, remember, the disease was just the excuse. They started massacring and lynching. All these Chinatowns across the US got burned down and all the Chinese people got massacred and killed.
Mm.
And there's a book out by Jean Falzer. She's a professor who talks about it. And she's given interviews for NPR. And she's just like, it's incredible. It's shocking. It's horrific, right? But nobody talks about it. It is no less horrific than like what happened to African Americans in this country. But nobody talks about it, right?
Right.
And the reason why we don't talk about it, I'll give you the reason. You know, people are always wondering, oh, and this is something you see online a lot, or Asians in general know this. Oh, Democrats are racist towards Asians and Republicans are racist towards Asians. Why is that? Why is everybody racist towards us in America, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, because you can't. Who on the Democrat side is fighting for, like, for example, Asian guys? You know, who's talking about, like,
yeah.
Right? Either way, whether Democrat or Republican, they make fun of Asians, they're racist towards Asians, right? Why is that? Again, comes down to foreign policy. Foreign policy. America has been at war with Asia from 1898 until today. You know what's funny is that after they banned all the Chinese from coming here and killed them all, they actually started a campaign to invade China. You literally banned Chinese from coming here because you're so racist. You don't want them around you guys, and you killed all the ones here. And then you're going to go invade that country. That's why they invaded the Philippines, by the way.
Wait, what percentage of the Chinese men that were here were killed?
Significant numbers, right? Either they died, you know, without having any children, of course, because the gender ratios were like 20-1 to 100-1. That's where you had Chinese bachelor societies, you see? I don't know. Have you heard about those?
No, I haven't.
Chinese bachelor societies were like these Chinatowns where you only had guys. And it was as a result of the Page Act, right? And that's where a lot of the stereotypes came about, like, oh, Chinese men are gay because they have no women. Yeah, okay, motherfucker.
there must have been a few, like, out of all those Chinese men, there must have been at least a couple who were pretty good at, you know, maybe meeting white women. No?
There was some. All right, so here's the thing, right? Not only did they ban Chinese women from coming here, remember what the end purpose was. Emasculation is genocide, okay? Mm-hmm. Emasculation, the actual idea, emasculation is such a garbage term for what they're actually doing. It's ethnic cleansing, okay? And it mirrors what they did overseas. So the idea was that, you know, like you come here and not only do you prevent them from marrying your own kind, you prevent them from marrying other. So in states where there was a significant Chinese population, they passed anti-Oriental, anti-miscegenation laws against Mongoloids and Orient, right? And so some Chinese guys found ways around that by like running away to different states to marry somebody and like shit like that, you know? But overall, it was really tough. Just remember that most of Americans were like lynching Chinese at that point, while also invading the Philippines so that they could invade China.
That was Teddy Roosevelt, wasn't it?
Yep, Teddy Roosevelt. But I mean, it's a proud tradition. I mean, Korea was the same thing. They colonized South Korea, which is still to this day a vassal state under the racist U.S. empire, purely as a foothold into Asia to project force into China. Because in 1898, congressmen were actually saying, we want to take over China. We want to invade and conquer China because for the human resources and for the ability to sell them our products, right? Resources and selling them our goods. Like that's where the story of capitalism intertwines with imperialism, in order to keep expanding the, like infinite profits, right? Because now society is just about making money. The only way to do it is to continue to grow the capital market, and China is the biggest market on this planet.
Okay, so if South Korea is a vassal state of the United States, the racist U.S. empire, as you put it, what other countries in Asia? I assume Japan or any Asian country that has a military base for the U.S.?
Right, yeah, military bases. I would also say any country where the U.S. is running the country through client government. So they did this in Indonesia, right? They overthrew Sukarno, right, who was a revolutionary nationalist in Indonesia that fought off the Dutch oppressor and, met up with Malcolm X and set up the new emerging forces to fight back against Western imperialism. They tapped this General Suharto to rule instead, you feel me? So they performed coups, illegal coups in all these countries and installed their own leaders when they couldn't directly control them.
Okay, then what is North Korea then? If South Korea is a vassal state of the United States empire, is North Korea the true Korea, or what are they?
I would say North Korea is just an alternate. Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to position it like that, you could call it like the original Korea, right? Because it's the government that the people of the country elected Kim Il-sung, right? Like the Kim Jong-il's father. He was a famous general. He fought the Japanese forces when they were occupying Korea. And then America came through, reinstalled all the Korean traders that had worked with the Japanese into positions of power, right? Like
Kim Il-pa.
Yeah.
Okay, so Kim Il-sung, that's not a disputed thing, right? That Kim Il-sung was a revolutionary who fought for Korean independence? Or is
that's not
controversial?
How can you dispute that? That's just facts.
That is fact. So would you say even the most, let's say, right-wing South Koreans, they would acknowledge that Kim Il-sung was who fought against Japan for Korean independence?
To be honest with you, South Koreans have been brainwashed for so long that it's hard to say. They make fun of North Korea propaganda, but South Korean propaganda is, okay, so going back to the whole liberalism versus authoritarianism, this false dichotomy. They're like, oh, because the propaganda comes from the government, clearly the people are brainwashed and not free. Well, in Korea, there's something called Chojungdong. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, the 3 papers.
Yeah. They had something like some crazy market share of media, like 60% of like newspaper subscribers in 2010. I mean, they used to be even more, like 75%.
Yeah, so the Chojungdong, as I recall, stands for the Joseonilbo, Jungang-ilbo, and Donga-ilbo, right?
Donga-ilbo, yeah, that's right.
Okay.
They're all pro-US, liberal, hyper-capitalist papers. The reason they are is because the people that are creating the power elite in South Korea are traders. There have been traders that were installed, in generations of traders that were installed into positions of authority when the United States first colonized South Korea. And they've been shaping the direction of society ever since.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to say with North Korea because, I mean, my dad was a refugee from North Korea. I've never been there, so it's hard for me to say what the actual living conditions are. But I don't trust any shit that comes out of, like, the New York Times or BBC. Get the fuck out of here. Like, these imperialist fucking rags.
Right.
And, the funny thing is I often use Western sources just to throw it back in their faces because I'm like, you guys wrote this. You guys admitted to this. And then you guys just pretended like we didn't, like we forgot.
Right, so would you say Asian Americans then are basically completely just fucked in the head? They don't have any concept of who they are or anything about their past or their
So
anything.
the reason why Asians in America continue to struggle with their identity is that they have that idea of an identity. Okay, if you really want to focus in on what an identity actually is, it provides a framework to navigate the world, right? It provides you a personal framework to understand the things that are happening and to react and plan for those things, right? For those circumstances. And the reason why Asian Americans constantly bitch about identity is because no such framework exists for us, right? Other than to just be a bootlicker, you know, a liberal model minority, whether you're Republican or Democrat, right?
Worship the Western ways of liberalism, democracy, capitalism.
Here's how I know. All right, if the Iwar Kuen were here today, look at how they specifically called out, I want police brutality against Asians to stop. I want Asian prisoners freed from prison, right? I want jury trials. When an Asian person is tried for a crime, I want juries of Asian Americans, not white people. This was one of the demands, right? So imagine in the coronavirus situation, when Asian restaurants are shutting down because of both the pandemic and racism, and people are getting thrown out onto the streets or, you know, have no source of income. You know, if you had organizations like the Iwar Kuen, right, these communist pro-Asian organizations, they're going to demand certain things, right? They're going to say, we're going to go to war with the government like the Yellow Vests in France, unless you guys, the government, which is supposed to represent the will of the people, takes care of the Asians that got knocked out of business because of this, right? But because organizations like the Iwar Kuen don't exist, right? The only time we might get a bailout is if like the Fortune 500, like the airlines get a bailout or the cruise lines get a bailout. You know, like we're not allowed to advocate for ourselves. You feel me?
Right.
Right? Because in the liberal spectrum, there is no place for Asian Americans because that liberalism is also tied to imperialism, and we're at war with Asia. Been at war with Asia for the last 122 years, still at war with Asia, which is why you can't get a date in America if you're an Asian guy. I know that sounds far-fetched, but now you understand how those things are linked together.